Hello, and welcome to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast with your hosts, Russell Martin and Brent Aiken. This podcast is all about equipping, encouraging, and inspiring youth pastors weekly with topics that are brought to the table by youth pastors from all over the world. And now, here's your host for this week, Brent Aiken. All right, hey guys, welcome back to the Student Ministry Conversation podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Brent Aiken, and today I am sitting down with Crystal Leake. And Crystal works with foster kids. She does a lot, but I'm going to let her tell you who she is, what she does, and a little bit about herself. So Crystal, take the floor. Tell us about you.
Absolutely. So like you said, my name is Crystal Leake. I am a licensed professional counselor supervisor in the state of Texas. And so basically what that means is I provide counseling. My area that I work with is children who are experiencing a removal or some kind of post-removal situation through Child Protective Services here in Texas. And so I work with those kiddos and have for about 6 years here in Texas in different settings with these kind of kiddos and teens. And so basically we're doing a lot of trauma counseling. So that's kind of my area of expertise is, just trauma and approaching trauma and helping the child, the foster parents, sometimes the biological parents. I'm able to do counseling with the child and the biological parents. We provide trainings through the agency I work with. I work with New Horizons. And so it's one of the many agencies. We do a lot of different things here at New Horizons. We have 2 residential treatment centers. I've worked at one of them when I first started here at New Horizons. We also have a child placing agency. So that it just basically means we train foster parents and help them and journey alongside them as they will take on different kiddos. We have a phase program, which is actually free counseling to anyone in Taylor County, any child between the ages of 6 to 17. And those do not have to be children in foster care. So our phase counselors go into the schools and they do sometimes I do some of that with some of those kiddos, especially if they're needing some more trauma work and some support there. We also have, what other programs? We have the program that I'm in, which is our New Horizons Family Counseling Center, and it's outpatient type counseling to support foster families and mainly the kiddos I see in individual. And I think I covered most of our programs that we do here at New Horizons. I'm also a foster and adoptive mom. I have adopted 1 kiddo through foster care. We have 1 bio kiddo. And then we recently had placed with us a baby cousin of mine. And that's called kinship care, which basically means it's a child related to you that's placed with you. That's the other program. It's a pretty new program to New Horizons, but we do have a kinship navigator program. Because when you're in kinship, you didn't really go in and get all this training through foster care. Sometimes you just suddenly have this kid, and then you're having to learn all the new language of the CPS system. And it's a lot of new language, and it's a lot coming at you, and a lot of like regulations and things. Every state's a little different. So I do wear some of those hats. I've also done a lot of ministry and chaplaincy and youth ministry in the past. And so counseling is actually kind of a second degree for me. I think that's a little nugget.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, I totally agree. And I've known Crystal for a little bit now through different interactions. And when we started talking about doing this kind of mini series on students on the Fringe, she was one of the first people I asked. Just for the sake of it's a really, really big problem. And the thing is I think largely one of the biggest problems with foster system and foster children and everything like that is people don't know the amount of foster children that are out there. And so just to make sure we're all on the same page, can you tell us a little bit more information on the current foster system as like a United States? We're looking at all the different states because we do have different state listeners, but then also how many kids are currently in the foster system?
So I don't know our current statewide, United States wide. I will add, I did live in Alaska and did work with kids. And in Alaska, it's OCS instead of CPS. So each state may have a little bit of different lingo. Department of Family Services is pretty much the lingo across the states. In Texas in 2020, because they're still pulling 2021 numbers, obviously we're, in 2022, but it takes them a while to really get all those numbers. I believe in 2020, we had somewhere upwards of 40,000, between 30 and 40,000 kids in foster care. And that may be with a relative placement, which is always what most states want to do, that relative placement first. They want to have that child with somebody that they already know, they already have that connection with, or even if it's a relative that they don't know, a relative that they still have those long-term biological connections. The other thing you'll see is in certain states, like in Alaska, they're really going to look at the native population. So if a child is from a tribe or has a tribal connection, they will really first look for that type of placement. They do in Texas as well. It's just, I heard about it more working in that area because in Alaska, there's just a greater population of Alaskan natives.
Sure. Yeah.
You have some
definitely.
of those elements. Now, one of the things we're seeing a shift in Texas specifically in is we are in a major crisis, and there's a few more states, and most states I'm hearing are in the same crisis where we have a lot more kids in care and a lot less homes willing to, take these kids in. And it's not really about the kids, it's about the system. A lot of times, I think people would take kids in their home, but jumping through the hoops of the system for good reasons, they're there. It's that checks and balance. It's there for good reason. It's the reason we have all these things put into place is because kids have been harmed, not only in biological homes, but also in care. And so it creates a little bit of a crisis. And so I think the biggest crisis is just the lack of beds and lack of place for these kids to go, especially the older they get. So, this is really talking youth ministry. Nobody wants a teenager. I mean, I don't think my parents wanted me as a teenager. So
Yeah.
it's always pretty sassy. And so, imagine that without all the years of like bonding with your teenager, and then you just have this teenager placed in your home and they've gone through trauma, they've gone through really hard stuff, and they're not trusting,
Sure.
and they're not, all of these things. So it's a nationwide concern and a nationwide issue right now.
Yeah. And I mean, coming from, I totally understand. And we've jumped through our fair share of hoops and checks and balances and all those. And the thing is, I mean, I would agree that it's probably the most frustrating part of the system. But I mean, you can't say that you don't see the purpose for it, if that makes sense, just because there are so many people that try to abuse the system. There are
Mm,
so many people that do it incorrectly.
right.
And for the people that are actually trying to do it right, it does seem like an incredibly um, insurmountable task sometimes, but it's all for the betterment of that kid, or kids, or I mean,
The
however
group
many
things.
you have.
Mhm.
So, and while that is a conversation in and of itself, and if
Yeah.
you're listening to this and you've ever considered fostering, I would heavily encourage you to go do some more research. We
Yes.
can throw some links in the show notes for this on where you can get involved, and maybe it's something you've been thinking about or praying about, or just maybe you don't want a kid specifically and you're not set to be a foster family. There's still 100 different ways that you can support the
Okay.
foster system without taking a kid. And so we will throw some of those links into the show notes on how you can be more involved in the foster system. But specifically, we are talking today about how youth pastors can better serve foster kids within their community and also within their own groups. And so, specifically, first, say, maybe my group doesn't have foster kids,
Mhm.
or maybe my group, maybe we have a few foster families, but the foster kids don't come to youth because it's
Mm.
awkward or anything like that. How do we work to serve the foster students in our community better?
Yeah, and that's a major packed question. I think the first thing, and I believe this wholeheartedly, I believe this when I did serve as a youth minister, I think the biggest thing is you got to know your resources. You are a mini social worker in a bottle. Like you just are. It's part of that. One of the many hats you wear as a youth minister is knowing the resources. So I think there's two parts to this. There's the one part of prevention. If you have a kid on the fringe and you know you're about to have to make a call, because you as a youth minister, you're a member of the part of the society that you have to make these calls to CPS when there's neglect or abuse or things like that going on. But it's also like, man, could we catch that 20 steps ago and as a church wrap around support to this family somehow and get them involved in services and try to help prevent a full removal. And there are lots of ways to be involved there. And I think looking at your kids, the first step is looking at your current kids. Just because you think everything's okay doesn't mean it is. I'll never forget when I was, at the time I was at Chaplain, and I was at a kind of a meet and greet and connecting thing we went to about once a month as different ministers and parachurch organizations here in town. And this police officer came to talk about abuse and those types of things. And one of the things he said, and this was probably about 15, 20 years ago, that really has stuck with me. He said, you know, on one side of the town, it's all in the front yard. All the yelling, all the abuse, all the neglect, everything is just right there, paraded in the front yard for everyone to see. He said, on the other side of town, it's behind pretty white picket fences because abuse is everywhere.
Ouch.
And hurt. Yeah. I mean, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
So don't just assume that your kids, I mean, and goodness, nowadays kids are like ready to tell you all the problems in like 2 minutes and they just want to live in those problems and instead of find solutions. But so I think that's the first thing is working with the preventative care, working with knowing these things about your kids. Connection is the number one thing. Connect. I can't say that enough, you know, and it's really getting to know kids and connecting with them on a different level, even though it's hard to connect with kids or hard to reach. And that's why having volunteer base is so important, because me and my crazy personality is not going to be it for every kid. You know, we need some of those sponsors and stuff that are just real quiet. They're not going to say a lot, but they're there because the kid who's really quiet sees that sponsor and says, it's okay for me to be a quiet person. So we need some of those volunteers in those youth ministries. So prevention being that first step. Second step is, man, maybe we have a kiddo or a family that wants to do foster care. One of the churches here in town, and they're really working with a lot of our other churches, does what's called Foster Care 325. So it's Foster 325. It's an initiative to help other churches, because this particular church does a great job wrapping around support to the child or teen, to the family who's taking in the foster family. And sometimes they even wrap some support and services with the biological family. They have a lot of, they go the extra mile. Like they have full wrap teams where you can just say, hey, I need some diapers. Like we just got a kid placed with us last night and we need size 4 diapers. And they'll have like size 4 diapers on your doorstep within 24 hours. So, I mean, those are some of those ways to help support that family in your church who's choosing to go on this journey. Because the journey of foster care, like even to babysit a kid, they have to have full training. So that's how some of the people support, you know, maybe there's just some of your, you know, persons or you as the youth minister, go ahead and get that training so that if the kid needs to come over for a few hours or whatever, you've done all the training you need to help support that child in a different way. The other ways I was kind of thinking is, you were asking this question, is kids in foster care, they don't want to feel different. They don't want to be all like, oh my gosh, you know, so really watching and listening to your kids who like to spread those rumors, who like to talk behind backs and things like that, like just saying, hey, it's not okay. How would you feel if somebody was just talking about you and your family in that way? And then what do we call, like, especially a teen? They're like, well, what do I call this foster parent? They normally just call them by their first name. Sometimes they'll call them mom and dad. And so it can just kind of be an awkward conversation. So being prepared to have those conversations, have those discussions, talk to the foster parents, say, how do I support you? You know, what do we need to watch out for? A lot of kids coming into care, you know, they have had a lot of trauma and maybe you're in like a smaller group and you got a pretty decent set of kids who don't really do a lot of the, you know, bad things, you know, but then you have this kid coming in who came from a really rough background and, you know, they're using some marijuana or they're influencing some of the kids in some negative ways. It's finding ways to pull that kid aside and mentor them and talk to them and kind of help them understand, like, these kids don't understand this. Sometimes a kid from care will overshare. They will start telling about this traumatic event and your other kids are like, I've had this happen. Actually, I had a youth minister reach out and was like, I don't know what to do with this situation because, you know, I have a set of kids who were like, they live in a bubble. And all of a sudden we have this kid who was like horribly abused And so we had to talk through ways to help the child understand this is the audience to share that with. Like, I, as your youth minister, understand what to do with that, but kids your age, they just don't understand. And so we're helping that child with the care and compassion of their story and who and when and how to share their story. Because that's a big thing that comes up a lot of times. Now, some of you may be youth ministers where you're like, listen, I got 20 kids right now that could be removed any minute. Like, you just work with that inner city group of kids, or you just work with those churches on the fringe that's where you're at. That's where your ministry is. And probably you've done a lot of trainings and whatnot. So I would say the number one thing is this: if this is your first introduction to it, it doesn't need to be your last. Get some trainings going. Train your people on trauma-informed care. There's some different churches in town. We've even gone and done trauma with, I'm a trust-based relational intervention practitioner. And basically that's a fancy set of words to say it's a set of ways to train people on how to approach kids from hard places. Excuse me. And it's really good even with non-foster kids. It's a great approach. So it's one thing you could reach out and try to find some training in as well.
Yeah, I think training is super important. And the thing is even one of the things that, and it's called different things in different areas, I'm sure, but there is something that is still getting training that is a great benefit to foster families, and that's called respite care or respite certification. And so with that, even you as the youth pastor getting that certification, they don't have to worry about their foster kid going on a trip with you. They don't have to worry about them like coming to hang out at your house or anything like that, because you're already certified. You have all of the training and the background that's done. And I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it is a little bit of classroom work and a couple classes and certifications that you have to do in order to get that. But in the long run, if you have kids in your ministry that have it, or that are in the system, or like Crystal said a second ago, or you're working with inner city kids that, I mean, at any given moment could be taken, then it's a win-win in my opinion, just for the sake of it's so valuable for you and the opportunities that you'll have to minister to those people. And that's one of the biggest red flags or red tape moments that we'll have. So we talked about kind of youth pastors reaching out to kids in the foster system in the community, and how we can get better informed and we can learn how to get certified and all that. Say a foster kid walks into your youth group for the first Wednesday or first Sunday. How do you go about making sure that student is a part of the group and feels welcome?
Man, the same way you should with any kid, right? Like, that's awesome. You may not, you're not going to know if they're a foster kid or not most of the time, unless you do know. If you do know, I would say, like, if you have a foster parent in your church and they're like, hey, we're going to take this teenager, try to meet the teen before group. Try to just ask, hey, can I just meet this kid before they come in? That way you kind of know a little bit about them. Some youth ministers have like student leaders who are like, hey, if there's a new visitor, to say, oh, why don't you sit with so-and-so and introduce them to so-and-so. Social dynamics are so strong with our high schoolers and junior high kids. Like, they're always going to be there, and depending on which group you have, depends on which social dynamics you have going on. So really making sure you're connecting with them, you're going up, you're talking to them. I would hope we would be greeting anybody that way. I always like to have some student leaders that I knew, like I was teaching them the social skill of, hey, when a new kid comes in, let's reach out to them. Let's do this. Let's do that. Now that's different in a very large church. The larger your church gets and the greater and bigger your group is, you're going to need more of that, because you may have 100 kids walking in. Some of you guys are probably coming on here and you have like a few hundred kids in your ministry. Whereas others, like I know 2 of the places I did youth ministry at, we're talking little bitty small towns. And at that point with one of them, I had a really small group at first. They just some things happened, and we've all been there. When the previous person just burnt a lot of bridges. And, this particular set of people, they were doing their best. They were really young. And so they didn't really know what they were doing. And so then when I had come in, and started kind of actively, helping these kids heal from some of the stuff that they were being taught that wasn't very biblical or theologically sound. And then we were kind of building this base of kids. And then within a year, we had like 50, 60 kids showing up. I might have 10 new kids a night. And I'm like, who are all these kids? Like, I don't know. So one thing, like, kids don't like to stand up in front of everybody and be like, I'm so-and-so. So I would always say, hey, who's your guest? Or, hey, I want you to get to know this person and introduce them to the group. And I always had like a set of group expectations at the beginning of the night. I just always had like, hey, because I think what we forget about in youth ministry and in church, like sometimes we forget that discipline's okay if it's done in love and care. And so just having some of those discipline tricks and things up your sleeve are really good. So connecting with a kid, getting another kid, having your active kids be able to connect with the kid, and then helping them feel like, hey, checking in with them at the end of the night. How did you like that? Was anything awkward? It's okay. Like if it was, some of our kids in care may have really high anxiety. And so coming into a group may be too much, and you also may have a foster kid in your church who refuses to come to youth group. That doesn't mean you shouldn't go meet with them. Maybe you build a personal relationship with them and help them grow, because a lot of our kids don't trust adults. And in fairness, the adults they were with weren't trustworthy, and some of our teenagers, man, if they're getting removed as a teen, it's pretty bad, because a lot of times they don't remove a lot of teens because at that point, there's all these layers going on. And then the other thing I think about too is if you have a big enough group where, you have a kid coming in and you don't know, but you find out they're in foster care, really pulling them aside and saying, hey, if you need any support, just let me know. And just letting them know you're a listening ear for them.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's super important. And since you do have a little bit of ministry background, I am going to throw a curveball at you. Would the way that you approach the gospel change with a foster kid?
No.
Okay.
And here's why. The way I approach the gospel is, right now we have this whole like push. And to me, I feel like it really happened more about 5 or 10 years, even after I was coming out of seminary, maybe, just like this whole bigger push of health and wealth and all of this. And I'm like, that's counter gospel to me, because the reality is Jesus came for the hurting. All of our biggest, names in the Bible did some awful stuff, like,
yeah,
you look at Moses. Hello, he killed somebody. David, let me just cover up all this. Let me get this man killed since I slept with his wife and now she's pregnant. And like, this stuff is like spilling the tea, like the Bible tea is all over the place. And so I think with kids who come from those hard places, you're like, hey, this is the place you should be, because let me tell you, have you read the Bible? Do you know how this stuff is? I was like, all this stuff you're telling me. Oh yeah. So I think knowing your Bible stories and kind of helping them connect. So like, well, God's not going to love me because I did this. I've been, sleeping with my girlfriend and I'm on marijuana and this, that, and the other, and all these 5, 6, 7. Oh, have you heard about so-and-so? And then you take them to that Bible passage. To me, that's like letting the gospel breathe, because it's a reality. It's a messy book.
Definitely.
Got some messy stories, and we're all messy. We're all messy.
Sure.
And so I think for me, it solidified that approach more than anything, because I grew up in that, like when I was younger, you have the little bracelets with all the colors and like all of these different things, and they're great tools for evangelism. But I felt like our evangelistic style was off. Like, that's not like, we made it pretty. I'm like, it's not pretty. Jesus went into these awful situations. He didn't make them pretty. He walked with them beside the hard. So I think that's the thing.
Yeah. We often Veggie Tale stories or children's church stories, to where we take all the negative things.
Or we make our nursery, and no offense to anybody on here, because somebody's done it, I know it, but like your whole nursery is Noah's Ark. I'm like, where are the floating dead people? They're like bloated. Where are the floating dead people? I'm just asking.
Yeah, that's very true. It's one of those stories. It's like, that's about as dark as they come. But like, it's one of those things. Like, if you view it from the lens of the world, it's like, so how is this a good story? And then
when I was doing the chaplain, kind of having my chaplain role here at New Horizons, Every week we would have chapel. And these kids, man, you do chapel with a group of foster kids, you better gear up. It's like, honestly, it was more like doing prison ministry than anything else. And I don't mean that in a weird way. It's just that they've walked through hard things. So they're going to bring up these hard questions. And I remember when that song came out, Leave the 99. What,
Yeah.
you know what song I'm talking about? Why it's not
Reckless
coming.
Love.
Thank you. Reckless Love. That was on repeat every week. Like these kids begged for it at the beginning and at the end, because it spoke to them. This idea that like, really, Miss Crystal, you're telling me that God would leave all of this and he still loves me? Like, 'cause some of them were getting these messages from their parents that they weren't loved, because man, sometimes their parents just couldn't get off the drugs. And I'll say this here because I got to say it somewhere. Never tell a kid. And if you have, go back and remember who you told and apologize to them. Kids, okay, they get told this by society and it's not true. A parent doesn't love drugs more than their kids. It's not possible. First of all, the biblical idea of love and addiction are not the same thing. Drug is an addiction. A parent who cannot get off of drugs and they're struggling with their addiction, we have to help a kid realize that. We have to help them see the healing power there is saying, hey, your parent's addicted. And what I tell kids is like, okay, for the next month, I just want you to be off all sugar. That means anything that has sugar in it so then we start looking at what has sugar in it. Everything in a bag, in a can, in a box, all of that has sugar in it. Some kind of hidden, not healthy sugar. Then you have all the alternate sugars like stevia and aspartame. You got to get off all that too. And the only sugar around is a natural source, which is only going to be fruit. So basically what you're going to be eating is meat, veggies, and fruit. Only if it comes from, the ground, because you go to bread has that secondary sugar, that carb that turns into sugar and isn't healthy, right? Kids look at me like, Miss Crystal, I can never do that. I'm like, that's what it's like for your parent to get off drugs. Like it's the hardest thing they're going to ever do in their lives in any kind of addiction, right?
Yeah,
and so
that's
it's
a good
helping
point.
them understand the love of God is different. So I really think that's a big thing too, is talking about the reality of the love of God, that it's unconditional, like no matter what they do or what their parent does, they're still loved. And it's not about the good or the bad that gets us into heaven. It's Jesus. It's that he sacrificed. And so I think these kids, when I was doing this, the chaplaincy role with them, and even when I was a chaplain in a psychiatric hospital, that basic message is like, whoa, that's a big deal.
Yeah, without a doubt. And it's an important one. And I mean, I think that's more where my question kind of came from, is not necessarily changing the gospel, but approaching it from the standpoint of like, there's this love that does not go away. There's this love that, I mean, you cannot do anything wrong to like lose it or anything like that. And so I think it's a super, super important. I mean, I love what you said though. Like it is such a commonly said thing to where it's like, oh, well, your kids or your parents love like whatever they were doing more than you. And it's like, that's, first off, why would you tell that to a kid, even if it was true? I mean, and secondly, I mean, love and addiction don't even hit the same playing field.
Well, and I think our definition lately, well, not ours, I would say the definition being pushed about love in America right now, in this culture, it's almost like this. If you disagree with me or some lifestyle choice I'm making or anything, then you don't love me. But, when I was young, the message we got was, I love you. And if you make these choices, you're going to be in trouble, but you're still loved.
Yeah.
It's a different approach to understanding love.
Yeah.
And so growing up in church, like I grew up in church since I was born. But my husband, however, he grew up in a whole different denomination. Well, it wasn't even a denomination. He would tell you it's a total different religion. And then he started realizing, wait, the Jesus to this religion and the Jesus in Protestant Christianity were not the same. The role wasn't the same. The route to heaven, if you will, poor theology statement from me, I get it. But for all intents and purposes, what we're talking about in this moment, was through Jesus. And so this confusion of love And the definition of love to me is one of the trickiest things Satan's doing with our kids
Yeah,
nowadays. He's
without a
making
doubt.
them think, if you don't believe all of these things, then that's a not loving person. It's like, well, can't we just disagree in love? I mean, I remember in seminary, we would go at it. We would just be, well, I think this, da, 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 the Bible said, but you're forgetting this. I mean, it would be really intense. And I remember a new person came to our seminary and they were like sitting there looking at all of us. And then after class, we're like, hey, let's all go get a coffee. And then we'd go get a coffee and hang out. And you're like, she literally was like, aren't y'all mad at each other? I'm like, why would we be? Just
Yeah,
because we disagree theologically doesn't mean we don't care about each other and what's going on in each other's lives. And I
yeah,
think that we've got to teach that. We've got to teach that to foster kids too, because they have all these negative thought patterns and just swirling around in their heads.
yeah.
Just teaching them that love is bigger than all of that. Like God's love is just unconditional.
Well, and their expectations about life are built on the wrong side
Mhm.
of life, unfortunately, because I mean, they don't get pulled out of homes for no reason. I mean,
Exactly.
typically bad things happen. Typically things that induce trauma and everything else in between. And so we really have to kind of reshape that norm of saying, hey, I know that this feels like normal, but this is not normal. Like,
Exactly. And help them understand I'm not judging your mom and dad.
yeah,
I get kids in my office all the time, and especially the older they are when they're removed, depending on the situation, they're mad at foster care, and everybody's just trying to convince them, like, we're just trying to protect you. We're just adults who love you and try to protect you. They don't get that at the first of the removal. It takes sometimes years to understand that, or months. And so just listening to them and not telling them. I think if you were going to do a blooper, the bloopers of being a youth minister working with foster kids is trying to convince them that all the adults are just trying to help them. I think you just listen to them and say, yeah, it can be frustrating when the adults in your life don't really get it. Yeah, I remember feeling that way too. I mean, different reasons, but I see what you're saying. I hear what you're saying, so
yeah,
I would say that biggest approach is just listening first and just kind of parroting back to them what they're telling you. So I think you're saying this. Now, they'll go and say, well, they agree with me. And I have that happen all the time. I was like, oh, did I ever agree with you? Or did I say I understood where you were feeling and coming from? And then after I build that connection, I might say things like, well, now I'm a little confused because you're feeling that way, but it's not working for you. Like, I wonder if there's a different way to look at it. Could I show you a different way to look at it? And then that's when you can sometimes bring in those more spiritual ideas and things that may be new. You don't know, a foster kid could have grown up in church, and then also on the other side of it, that may be their first experience with church. I've had a lot of kids that, because they're not allowed to stay home by themselves, the families at church, so they have to go to church, and they're not even Christians. And so they're not going to want to tell you they don't believe in God, but it's okay to ask, like, oh, if you don't believe in God, that's okay. We still want you here.
yeah,
Like, this isn't like some club, like you can only
yeah,
come if you believe in God. I mean, I hope not. I hope that's not what our
yeah,
youth ministries are. I hope our youth ministries are like, I don't care who you are. You're high, come on in.
yep,
Let's get you some coffee and sober you up. And then let's talk about, all these things, because we want to be, Jesus to the people. And he
yeah,
went everywhere, but he didn't let them stay that way, right? Like Jesus always brought that gospel in and brought that change, that idea of like, I have something different to offer you than what your current life
yeah,
is right now.
definitely. So, just for the sake of kind of continuing this, can you maybe this is a youth ministry story, maybe this is when you're during chaplaincy or what you're doing right now. Can you recall or share a positive story to where you saw not only the foster system work,
Mhm.
but also where a kid actually had the community like kind of
Mhm.
come around them and actually, I guess, a success story for lack of a better.
So yeah, I'm thinking about, I kind of want to share two, and here's why. I want to share one that led to adoption, and I want to share one that led to a reunification. Buzzword reunification means the child or the teen is going to be placed back with the biological parent. And the reason I want to share on both sides of that is, and I'll even give a little mini confession right now. So we have this sweet, adorable, she is the most adorable baby in the whole world, I swear. She's just precious that, we're loving on right now. And her mom is my cousin. And we're getting to know the dad through this process. And then, respectfully, I won't share details on either side because I want to respect their history and their privacy. But the hardest thing as a foster parent, and even as a kinship parent, and I experienced this with my son as well. I love them so much. Like, they're not mine to give back, but we hear that language. And sometimes I fall into that language. It's not my kid to give back. Like, they have birth parents. And so it's this weird feeling because, like, if I could keep her, I would love to. It would not hurt me at all to adopt her because she's so amazing. And that's how I felt about my son too. Like, he's so amazing. And, even at his final trial, like, some other time you could have me on here, you can have a whole testimony of that stuff. But it was always remembering, like, I have to constantly be in prayer and just telling the Lord, like, hey, you got to make my heart right on this, because attachment happens. Like, I love this little baby and I'm all she knows right now. And my husband's really all she knows is dad. And so it's a little bit different, right? Like, so when you're ministering to these kids, remember you're ministering to the foster parents and their hearts and their struggles and their frustrations and all the things that come with that. So let's talk a reunification story. This is really one of my favorite ones. It is about a kid that's a little bit younger. The reason I'm choosing this one is he's done harder work than most of my teenagers can do. This kid was mid-elementary age, and it was at a residential treatment center. He was not adjusting into foster homes. And normally we see kids adjusting pretty okay when they're younger, but there's this sense of, like, loyalty and disloyalty. It's always this sense of, like, who do I be loyal to? And it's this, for a lot of kids I work with, that it's just this unknown. Whereas some, like one kid I had, we had a whole counseling session with his bio mom, and he looked at her and he said, you're not getting clean, and I love you, and I know it's hard, but can you just let me go so I can just be in a stable home? That's all I want. I want to be adopted because I want stability, and you just can't provide that for me, but I'll always love you. And that was, like, probably the hardest counseling session I've ever done. Yeah. It was the hardest counseling session I ever done. And I actually sat with the mom for a little bit. He said, would you sit with my mom? Like, he had built such a trust in me as his counselor. He said, would you sit with my mom and help her with what I just told her? I said, oh, okay. So he walked out the door and I just sat with her. And
Golly.
was like, yeah, these are the moments when you decide to do counseling, right? And so we have those moments. And he came in the other day. Oh, I'm sorry. I said I was starting with a bio, but I'm going to start with the adopted. He came in like about a month ago and he's doing great. He's still struggling. It's not like, here's the thing. It's not like some little happy bow happened. It's not some present.
Yeah.
And you opened it and you have these new, whatever, and they're awesome and you love them. And it is, but life is messy. Just because you adopted a child doesn't mean suddenly all the mess went away. Adoption to me is saying, I love you enough to walk you through the journey of life with your mess. And you're stuck with my mess now. Right? I mean, kind of like marriage, like my husband's stuck and he is,
yeah.
Yeah, we have divorce, but that's not our thing in our marriage. So we're like, oh, you're stuck with all this spicy disaster right here. So I think that's the biggest thing is, like, it's not like support doesn't stop just because, they get adopted. And so this kid's still in a lot of support services. He still has it takes a village for any kid, especially kids that are on the fringe. So for him, just seeing him come back in and be with an adoptive person. And I asked him, I said, okay, so since we did counseling together, I got to ask you. I mean, I know we're just sitting here in the lobby. Nobody's in here. Can ask you a real personal question. He goes, okay, Miss Crystal. And I said, so you remember that time we talked to your mom and you just asked her to, like, let you go? I said, do you regret that? And he said, no. He said, in fact, I just got done talking to my grandparents because this particular person that adopted him has helped him navigate who in the biological family is safe and who's still on drugs.
Yeah.
Because that's the piece after post-adoption, like we're gonna have to do that with our son. Like his parents, we gotta help him. And we already talk about this with him, and he's 6. Like, hey, as you get older, like which biological family members are safe and not safe, and it's messy, right? There's no right answers. Same thing with my little cousin that we have. Like if we end up adopting her, like how do we navigate making sure the parents are clean and sober, making sure that there's safety there, making sure they're not gonna
Yeah.
get in the way of the parenting for the good, for the betterment of the child, all of those things. And so for him, he was like, yeah, it's bumpy sometimes, but I'm glad I did that. Cause I even second guessed that. So I mean, and
Yeah.
that's really a success
That's
story.
unbelievably huge for
It
that
is
kid to say.
rare. I have had a small handful of kids who've just said, I can't live with my parent anymore. At young ages, they just recognize I need stability and they can't provide that for me. And it's rare. I mean, and you're talking to somebody who has to go talk to judges sometimes. And I'm like, hey, and then others that like on the flip side of that, they regret that decision later. But then I think in the long term, they do okay.
Yeah.
So another story I have is this one I started telling. So this kid had been in care. Mom's rights were already terminated to other siblings. And so what you'll find, this gets very confusing, the legal aspect of it. So this was a sibling set. However, they had different fathers, so they had different court cases. So his court case was completely different than his siblings. So different outcomes happened. So the siblings, they ended up, the rights were terminated. However, who was going to adopt them ended up being like cousins of the family. And so the bio mom, who at that point had stayed clean and sober, was going to get opportunity to stay in their lives. And she was one of your really rare bio moms. She was an ex-addict, and I have permission to tell her story. So I'm giving a little more details about her story because she has given me permission over and over and over and over. And so she's had a long battle with addiction. She had a very abusive man in their lives. And this child remembered like doing things. I mean, he was little. This was pre-removal. And he was probably about 4 years old and remembers what he later realized the dad was like very high and drunk. And he was starting to beat on mom. And he shoved him down like the little stairs of the motorhome. And he said, I remember him going like this and then just running away. It's almost like it just clicked to him what he was doing. And the man ran away. And he said, I slammed and locked the door. So he felt very protective of his mom. So he had this bond because he felt like he was always there to protect his mom and save his mom, even though he was little and he really couldn't, but he did sometimes. And so prior to my becoming involved with this child and this mom, she was like, oh no, those things never happened. Because she was still caught in her addiction cycle and in her codependency and all of these fancy terms that basically means she's stuck in it too, right? So she starts coming in, and I always meet with a parent first. I'm not going to put a bio kid in a room with their kid until I've met with a parent, because it'd be unfair in my opinion. Like I've got to prepare them. Like this child had like very distinct memories. And so we were working through those. And that's part of why he would have these extreme behaviors. I mean, he would yell, he would scream, he would kick, he would hit, but he was the kindest child. So he would have all of this extreme anger outburst. And yet when he's calm, he was probably the most empathetic boy you'd ever meet. And that's the thing with kids from trauma, is like they can be on either side of that. And so as we worked through things, mom was finally sober, working her services, and she was allowed per the courts to begin counseling, not just visits. And so I brought her in and I was like, where are we at? And she goes, this is the thing. I used to be magic eraser mommy. It was like a whiteboard, and I would just erase everything and say, let's pretend it didn't happen, and tell my kids it didn't happen. And now I realize it was how much more I was harming them. She said, I need to apologize to my son. And I need to really build trust again that he sees I'm not going to do that anymore. And she meant it, and she did it. And if I told her to jump 5 times and do 50 flips, she was going to do it if she thought it would help her kid. I mean, she really was doing the hard work. And nobody thought, I mean, her addiction had been years. Nobody thought it was going to happen. And we had some of the, I mean, guys, I'd have to leave after sessions and just go for a car ride and be alone, because they were probably some of the most emotional sessions, just for him to say, I remember this, and her to hold him and say, I'm so sorry that happened. And she owned her addiction. And she's trying to explain this to a young elementary kid. And over time, he built that trust back, and she ended up getting him back. I drove a pretty far way to tell the judge she's ready and he's ready, and they deserve a chance. And I can't promise you that she's not going to relapse in 2 years. She couldn't promise that. She's like, what I know is I've been sober for over a year now, and I'm on track to stay sober. And every year or so, she will message me and send me a picture of them, and they're doing great. She's still sober, and this has been a few years now. And so to me, those are success stories also. Just that she's like, it's not perfect, and we're working through things, and she goes to meetings all the time to try to, keep herself on track. But when she was finally ready to not be magic eraser mommy, that's what she called it.
Yeah.
And she was ready. And I think that's the thing, is the kid, he knew, I love your mom, even if she messes up. They just want to know, like, you care about them. Now, other kids hate their parents. They're like angry, they're uncertain, all of those things.
Yeah.
And so, it can be on either side. Now, one thing I didn't touch on, and I didn't give an example of, but we do need to talk about at some point in this podcast, is sexual abuse and how that can affect youth ministry. Because it does, to me, it does affect it a little bit different.
Sure. Well, why, for the sake of that, why don't we go ahead and go into it?
So I want to make some really strong considerations, things for you to think on. So not just our girls, our boys too, who've been sexually molested. One big thing to understand, when I was a chaplain at the psychiatric hospital, a lot of the adults I worked with, at first they were like, I don't talk to the chaplain, I don't go to church. That's fine. And then I'm just a genuinely cool person, I think. And so they would want to talk to me. No, I'm just a connector. And so like eventually they'd be like, okay, maybe I'll talk to this lady. And one of the things that I learned listening to their stories, I also often talk to a group here in town and I learn a lot from these ladies. They're a ministry called Emerald of the Sea. Definitely encourage all. It's a national ministry. Definitely check the Esme and her ladies out. I'll say that again, Emerald of the Sea. So they work right now primarily with adults. They are looking into what it'll eventually look like to work with teens. But they work with adult women who've been through some major sexual abuse or sex trafficking. So education. If you have any child or adult in your youth ministry who's been sexually trafficked or sexually molested, you definitely need to get some research going and figure those things out. There's a lot of layers there we don't even have time to get into. That's a whole another podcast in itself, because there are a lot of things that happen. But I have worked with a lot of women, and the sexual molesters in their life were people who were in the ministry. So either their fathers that were also ministers, or deacons of a church, pastors of a church, youth ministers of a church. You as a male or female youth minister never, ever need to be alone with a child. Don't do that. And never be alone with a foster child. And it's a protection for you and them. A child who's been through some type of abuse. Like I just had a kid, nobody knew he had been molested, and he went into a room and he was at school, and one principal was in the office and the other one was shutting the door and standing in front of the door. He flipped out. And we had done a lot of work in counseling together, and nobody knew. And finally, as I'm walking him through this one kind of approach I have, it was a flashback, and he finally admitted he was being prostituted out when he lived with his dad. And so that made him have a flashback to a memory of being locked in a room, having those things happen. So when you're dealing with a kid who's had, those types of experiences, and you see that flip, you immediately help them get calm, whatever that means. Who needs to come support them, who needs to help them. And that's part of why you don't ever want to be alone with them. The other thing is sometimes they can be in a flashback and not realize you're not doing that to them. So if you have a kid on kind of the more extreme side, mental health side, that's a whole nother podcast as well, dealing with kids who have major mental health issues, and how do we make them feel part of the youth ministry, even though we have to be aware. And that's the biggest thing, is going and knowing your kid, talking to the foster parent. The other piece of that is you could be the first person they outcry to. Just because they're removed doesn't mean all their abuse is known. And I have had kids who've been in counseling with me for almost a year and finally told me, most of the time my kids, after about 6 sessions, and I know I can see it coming, I'll tell the caseworker, this kid's about to outcry about sexual abuse. And they're going, that's not in their chart. I'm like, I'm telling you, it doesn't have to be in the chart. I've done this too long. I can read it like that. Not everybody can. It's just when you've worked with kids, you see these signs. And so when you're dealing with a kid from care that has had any kind of sexual abuse, you really have to be cautious and be caring and be careful, because it's those layers. And that may be why they don't want to come to the youth ministry. And if they ever tell you that, say, then that's okay. You don't have to come. Being part of the youth ministry doesn't mean you have to be a part of this group. I got other things if you want to be part of this or smaller things. Like make something up, build a new little mini group, whatever it takes, just to have people care.
Yeah. And I mean, we've definitely talked about it in other episodes. And I mean, it doesn't matter whether you know the kid for 50 years. I mean, forever.
Yeah.
You don't put yourself in a room alone.
No.
That's protection for you. That's protection for them. And there are way too many youth pastors that have not taken that seriously. And the ramifications on that have been huge. Whether they had intentions that were negative or didn't have intentions that were negative, and an accusation was just cast, because it's you against their word, and their word's always going to win.
It's always good. And you're going to lose your whole career. I mean, your whole,
Yeah.
but God's a bigger God. There's going to be protection for that. I've seen girls falsely accuse youth ministers and it fizzle out and them get in big trouble because there was no proof. Because we're like, our youth minister? No, like he's never in a room alone with a kid ever. But on the opposite side of that, I'm looking for a book. In a minute, I'll grab like 3 books. I'll show you all that are really good ones to maybe read through if you're in the ministry.
Sure. Yeah. So you talked about this a little bit earlier, and you talked about how we're all, as youth pastors, in that group that is a mandatory reporter. And I think that's pretty much almost state, like across state lines. I don't think there's any states that don't allow us to not be. And so with that, obviously there's positives, but there are some negatives. How does a youth pastor report abuse or report something that they see? And when is it the official time, I guess, to report?
Yeah, it's a great question. It is not your job to investigate. So the nice part of that, even as a counselor, I don't have to investigate. Sometimes kids are telling me something and I'm like, I may know all the layers there of why this may or may not be a true. It's just where their trauma brain is at the moment. Any of that, I don't have to investigate. I just report. So every state, you literally Google search reporting, and you're going to find your state number. There's a number in every single state. And I would know that number. The other thing you can do in the state of Texas, you can do it in Alaska, and I think you can do it in most states, because you can build an online profile if you have to, like, I have one, like I have to report all the time to the counselor. It's just part of my job. But I also have to report if it's a neighbor down the street, right? Like mandatory reporting means you report no matter what. And we have saved so many children and adults from human trafficking. We have to do human trafficking education for this agency working here, as well as for my license. And I watched a video the other day. It was really good. They did a great job with it, but it just talked about how somebody was willing to pick up the phone and report, and multiple humans were saved from being trafficked for sex, being trafficked for work. You'd be surprised how many adults get trafficked. So it's just really important. So learn your number, know your number. You can also do it if it's not an immediate emergency. You can do it on just the website and build a website profile and just do it through the website. But times you're going to report, If a child is talking about any harm, so, okay, we all talk about beatings and whoopings and we ha ha ha, but most your states are going to say a spanking on the butt that doesn't lead to bruising or inability to sit down. That's acceptable corporal punishment. Anything outside of that won't be. Now, here's where it gets tricky. You and I both know CPS is not going to remove this kid because they said one too many things to their mama and their mama popped them in the mouth and said, don't talk to me that way. Like that, so then we get confused. We're like, well, that's not really abuse. And I don't want to do that because I know this family and it was just a quick pop on the mouth. So that's where it gets tricky, right? Because we're like, they don't have any bruising. It was just a quick, like, reactionary. If they're getting into services or counseling or whatever, maybe you're opting not to. That's something you have to decide. The counselor, I have to report it, even if it's a pop in the mouth. And I'm like, don't blame you and their mouth. I'm not saying abuse is okay, but I get it. Most of us in my generation, we were all at one point popped on the mouth. Like I did not feel like I was abused because my mama popped me on the mouth for smarting off to her. So that gets a little tricky. So really what we're looking for is like, is this child consistently having that type of thing happen? But any bruising, anytime a child says something about being sexually, even if they don't tell you who, at least report it so that there's a report on file about the child.
Yeah.
When you report, they're going to want to know the name of the person and any information you have. So if you have a church database and it has all the information about that person, that's important. This is why I hear a lot of ministers tell me they don't like reporting. They're afraid they're going to lose their job because they're having to report on a high profile person, as it were, in the church. I'm like, yep. But saving that child from consistent and constant trauma is worth the job. I mean, it's worth my job. I'll walk away from this job if I have to, if it was something like that. And so I think it's just when we're in the ministry field, it gets messy and it gets yucky. And we've got to do what's right for the situation. Now, every state, you are not, they don't tell who reported. But we all know if that kid only told you, because you're the trusted person. Youth ministries become a trusted person. Now, a lot of times, if you're a male youth minister and you're dealing with a female that the volunteer is helping, then that gets a little trickier because you have to. So hopefully your church already has. Sadly, not enough of our churches do have a protocol. Your church needs one. If you don't have one, you can go tell your head pastor today. They could call me. That you need a protocol in your church and you need a training. Our church uses Ministry Safe. They only recently put that in because of some things that happened. And everybody's like, duh, why didn't we have that already? Because we're a large church. And so Ministry Safe was a good training, like to even work in any of our youth or child programs, you have to have that training. You're not even allowed to work or pick up a kid or do anything without that training. So definitely having trainings, training yourself and knowing your state number.
Yeah, no, that's very, very important. And the thing is especially with reporting, there's never, it's never like too much. Like, I'd rather be safe than sorry.
Exactly.
Just for the nature of, there's a lot of times I think that, especially I see it a lot at camps and stuff where there's multiple groups and the churches might know, but they're at like their church is there with like 17 other churches. And then they might say something. At very least, you need to report it to the director or the supervisor above you.
Yeah.
And that is minimal. I mean, you do not miss that step, because there is one thing with that is that they might tell you something and say, maybe you're a youth pastor that just got there. You've been there for less than a year. You go tell your pastor immediately, and your pastor hopefully is going to do one of two things. Okay, yeah, we know about it. It's already been reported. This has happened, etc. You don't have to report it at that point.
Not if you 100% know it was already reported and CPS was already involved. Now, if it's new information, you do.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's where it gets tricky. And at the end of the day, if you're just like, no, I need to report that, report it, because that's what I'm saying. The investigators, they have this screen in front of them that already says what was or wasn't reported. I've had that happen recently. I called in, I said, look, I'm sure this is the same information you have. And she was like, actually, there's a piece of that that's brand new that none of us knew. So thank you for reporting. And so it's solidified. Now that child doesn't have to go back to that family member.
Yeah.
Because they were removed from foster care and placed with a family member, and the family member began to abuse them. And so we see those things happen. So yeah. I agree with you. If your head pastor of the church is like, oh, we already have, that's already been reported.
Yeah.
Then it doesn't have to be re-reported. I never trust the kid. If the kid said it's been reported, I'm still going to make sure.
Yeah. And I will also say there's a difference between your pastor saying it has been reported and, oh yeah, we know.
Yes, totally different. Then you ask, was it reported? Like, was CPS involved? Like, because you're going to be like, and some kids like want to tell everybody, like I said, they want to tell everybody their trauma. You're a new kid on the block. So they want to tell all the things and they want to stir it back up. So you do kind of see, and then you can say, oh, it looks like that was reported. How was it? Like, how was that CPS involvement in your life? You know, you can kind of do some of those things, and always making sure to get those kids on the Fringe a counselor if possible. If the parents will let them. It's really important.
Sure. And so
good point there. Good point there, Brent.
Yeah. As we are closing out, and like you said, obviously we could stretch this into 3, 5, 7 episodes.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of this conversation, specifically for what we've talked about today, where can people go to get more resources? You said you had a couple books that you were going to recommend.
Yes. So let me grab those books. Pretty good. Okay. So here's what I got for you. If you have somebody a little more on the trained side, I have done this particular book with some girls, and I've done them in a teen group, but you need somebody trained. You need releases of information. Anytime you're going to do anything, like maybe you're just going to provide a space for a counselor to come in, and because maybe you found out you've got 3 or 4 kids, they've all had sexual abuse and they need some support. So this one's called SOAR. It's a great book. It's really Nicole Braddock Bromley. Check her out. This is her story of her coming out. And she lived in an affluent neighborhood with, nobody thought, everybody was surprised when she finally said that her stepfather had been molesting her. And it's pretty intense. And then this is the other book she wrote, kind of in companion. Now this has a whole this is the workbook. It has a book. It has a DVD series. I wouldn't recommend just anybody doing that with a group of girls. But if you really find like your church is ready to provide maybe a girls group for sexual abuse survivors, I would really partner with an OPC or a licensed counselor in getting that going. I think it can be very beneficial and I think very needed. There's also a book called Anchored, and it's another good one. It is by a group out of Oklahoma, and this is a great center. They do a lot of trainings and things like that, and it's called the Halo Project. They also use TBRI. I've done some trainings with them. And it's another good one. And that one actually just attacks the lies, that are in our heads and things like that. So it's a little, less intense. Her name is Anne Marie Miller. I was on I got to read this book before everybody else and get feedback and those kind of things. And this is her story and her journey. Sadly, she experienced a youth minister who had very narcissistic tendencies and then led into sexual abuse. But it was done in a very backhanded way because he made her feel like it was okay because he was like in his 20s and she was like 16. I mean, she was an older teen. And so she was thinking, oh, this is all okay. And as she got older, she realized, oh, that's not okay. He was abusing his power and, having that relationship. And we've all heard of that. We've all heard of, falling in love with one of your youth kids. And if you're some 20-year-old intern and she's 17 or 18, it happens, but you've got to wait. You need to know the laws in your state and you got to wait. Cause some girl, listen, when I was a really young youth minister, I was looking cute and all the boys would like try to hit on me or flirt with me. And I'd be like, ew, stop. Like,
Yeah.
gross. But I had to deal with that. So if you're younger and whether you're female or male, you're going to have girls flirt with you and you want to be cautious and careful about that. So
Yeah.
I would really encourage you to read this because just hearing somebody else's story of like when somebody went too far. And
Yeah.
then
Very good.
the other book I would say is called Homeless by Choice. I heard this guy speak. He has a crazy story, but he's one of the rares. He is one of the rare kids that came out of care, and he really never entered foster care. That's what made his whole story interesting. This is a hard book to read. All of these are. So, take care. I will say that if you are a person, and this podcast is going to reach somebody who's had some kind of trauma in your history, any of these books I've just suggested, you need to take care of yourself and make sure you're emotionally and mentally ready to handle it. You need to be aware of your own trauma history when you're dealing with kids and when it becomes too much. Everybody in the ministry,
Yeah.
everybody should have an accountability partner.
Yep.
If you don't, it's not okay. Because, and as a counselor, I have accountability to counselors. Literally, my two closest friends are counselors, like ironically. And so if we've had hard sessions or we've just had stuff that sits with us too long, we call each other and we have to unload that and we have to do our own work. And if you're in the ministry, you have to do your own work. You have to keep your spiritual balance in your life. And so just be cautious. If you read this guy actually goes into churches and he speaks across the nation. That's really his whole thing. Roy is his name. He's a pretty intense speaker. So if you are a person in a kind of a rougher neighborhood, he'd be a great person to bring in to speak for you, but it's intense. So you got to be ready. Anytime you're going to talk about any kind of abuse, trauma, if you're going to attack that from the youth ministry standpoint, please, please, please give a trigger warning. Kids who've been through trauma, adults who've been through trauma. I always say, like, if I'm coming in and I'm talking about a topic to, like I'm doing a long thing on a topic, not like a podcast kind of thing, I'll always say, hey, if you're feeling triggered, if any of this is bringing up stuff from your past, it's okay to step out and just take care of yourself and just take some breaths and call your person or whatever, because that's really important. Anything can trigger people who've been through abuse. Anything can trigger us in the hard times we've gone through. So those are just some good resources for you guys to read and learn a little bit more and continue your journey.
Well, perfect. And so last thing we have, of course, is we do try to offer ways to have listeners connect. And so how can people connect with you, whether that be on social media, whether you want to share an email, shameless plug for anything you have going on?
It's funny.
Your moment to shine.
Hi, Mom. It's interesting because I've had a lot of people lately. It just keeps coming up. I've been asked to speak more or be on things like this. People were like, when are you going to start a podcast? When are you going to have some kind of website, something? I actually have my only social media presence is just my personal social media page. But if you have any questions or if you're local and you want somebody to come speak to your group or something, I do some of that. And so I would just say, reach out to me through email. My email is my name dot my last name, so Crystal, CRYSTAL .Leake, LEAKE at newhorizonsinc.com. And I'm sure Brent can put that in y'all's little thing at the bottom, and that'll be in the show notes. So just make sure that when you email me, you say, hey, Crystal, I heard you on Brent's podcast, because I do get a lot of random emails and I'll be like, what are you talking about? So yeah, I do a lot of trainings. And I'm doing a lot more of that. So I guess you're just one more person to remind me I need to get some kind of Facebook page or some social media page just on the speaking side of what I do. But yeah, would love to visit more with anybody who wants to.
Well, that's awesome. Well, Crystal, thank you for this. I mean, obviously, we can definitely collaborate in the future and maybe go into some deeper dives on some of those topics, because those are just as serious conversations that need to be had. I'd look forward to doing that in the future sometime. But as of now, that is all the time we have for this episode. Keep doing what you're doing. We thank you for your time on this show, and we thank everyone listening. Continue being impactful for the kingdom, and we're here to support you in any way we can. Have a great week, and we'll see y'all next week.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Brent.